Allegations relating to corruption, dishonesty and abuse of power have been levelled against Eskom's COO Jan Oberholzer. The power utilities, though, says that he is being cleared of wrongdoing, but not everyone agrees. And joining us to discuss this in depth, we're now joined by Sikonathi Mantshantsha, who is the spokesperson for Eskom and also the General Secretary of the South African Federation of Trade Unions, SAFTU, Zwelinzima, Vavi. To both of you gentlemen, thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting us to have yet another discussion about the matter.
All right, let me start with you, Mr. Vavi. On Monday this week, we heard Mr. Mantshantsha say that Jan Oberholzer had been cleared, and he gave us a brief explanation of what he meant by that. You were watching the program, and you felt that that wasn't the whole truth.
Absolutely, and that's why we felt that we have a right to reply to what we can only come to is a calculated, deliberate misinformation in defense of the company COO Jan Oberholzer. The truth is that here's a major correction that we feel that we must make. The first one is that there was no two investigations by two advocates on the matter involving Jan Oberholzer. The first so-called investigation was actually a grievance hearing, a grievance that was filed by a whistleblower who had raised issues about a contract that didn't meet even the internal standards of Eskom in relation to a payment to the tune of about 42 million rands to a company called Avenge. So he believed that as a result of him raising a flag about that matter, he was being sweared at work and that he was being bullied. So he filed a grievance against Mr. Oberholzer. A grievance was heard, and a grievance is not the same as an investigation. And so, but Mr. Sikonathi Mantshantsha keeps on repeating everywhere he gets an opportunity that there were two investigations by independent advocate who cleared Mr. Oberholzer of any wrongdoing. That's the first correction we feel that we must make. Just as a way of emphasizing, we think that the reason why they keep on saying that there are two investigations and one which is actually a grievance is to give weight to this grievance and as part of this deliberate drive to misinform the public and make the public to believe that this man is being harassed and by some aggrieved person. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the whistleblower is not some what-about person. He's not a teacher. It's somebody who holds a master's degree in engineering, who have been lecturing at the university for 6 years, and who have a 22 years of experience in Eskom. But everywhere else, we are being told that, no, this is just some lunatic person who can't perform. Thirdly, in relation to performance, this guy is a top performer, scored by everybody over a period of years, including by Mr. Oberholzer himself, that this is a star performer. And yet once there was this issue, suddenly he is being told, and we are being told everywhere else, that this is a poor performer and possibly corrupt person. Nothing can be further from the truth. And lastly, this is very important because this is our landing point. The report of Advocate Nazir Kasim does not clear the COO of Eskom, Jan Oberholzer. in two areas. The first area that is not cleared on is this: the report of the advocate, which has been made public thanks to the gallant efforts of our members of parliament, categorically state that Jan Oberholzer must be subjected to a disciplinary hearing in relation to his big push to get Eskom to pay for the 42 million rands, even though not just the internal processes of Eskom have raised flags, but also the Zondo Commission had actually produced a report after its own independent investigation, pointing out that the Avenge contract had all manner of irregularities that were amounting to a company wanting to be paid for not doing the work in terms of the prescriptions that it had signed for. And so the Kasim report says there must be disciplinary action. But then, surprisingly, the same report says wait until the court processes involving the same matter, because Avenge as a company have gone to court after Eskom refused to pay them, to say we are entitled to this money. So the report now says, and we are disappointed about that, says no, hold on, we must wait until the court processes have been finalized. We have a problem with that, Peter, because we can't imagine that any other worker would, after flouting the company processes, get the company to refuse or to be recommended that it must not take disciplinary action until after the matter has been heard in court. No worker gets treated in that same way. And the last point, the Kasim report actually says that it is true that Jan Oberholzer set and signed the extension of a contract of a company called the Sikonathi Stocks, the company in which he has shares. And this was not just signing, this was about expansion of a work that exists between Eskom and the company that he has shares in. That's a conflict of interest, and yet the report of the advocate says for that, Jan Oberholzer must just be counseled. We imagine, what if this same report was pointing to somebody else, other than the COO? Because we now know that a range of people were dismissed at Eskom for not avoiding a conflict of interest, for sitting in processes to determine processes in which they were going to benefit at a personal level. Same mistake, if it is a mistake committed by Jan Oberholzer. Yet now we are being told that he must be massaged on his hand, and that he must be let free, and nothing wrong. We think that this is not a statement to be communicated to the people of this country by a leadership that claims that they are the new brooms and that they are going to clean out corruption that we know took place over a long period of time at Eskom, that have resulted in that company being in a position where even today we have to endure hours and hours of load shedding. Thanks to the corruption mismanagement.
Let's get the other side of the story. Mr. Mantshantsha, you've been listening carefully. A lot of issues have been raised. Mr. Vavi is a bit concerned by some of the recommendations that the advocate made, but his first point of contention is that there were not two investigations. There was just a grievance hearing and then one investigation. So why have you been saying that there were two investigations?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and I must thank Mr. Vavi for making his speech and putting his facts to the fore. The first thing, Peter, we are going to limit ourselves to the discussion that we have been invited to have here, which is whether Jan Oberholzer has been cleared by Advocate Nazir Kasim and Advocate Mkwane before him. These are the facts. After the process in which Advocate Mkwane had in July 2019, the complaint against Mr. Oberholzer, which there were major, these were the points of the complaint. One, Jan Oberholzer was conflicted in his dealings with a company called Sikonathi Stocks because he had shares in there that he had not declared. Two, Mr. Oberholzer had put undue pressure on an employee of Eskom, the gentleman Mr. Vavi was referring to, and siding with a contractor for Eskom to pay that contractor. That was the complaint. And the third point is that Jan Oberholzer did not declare his interests. Advocate Mkwane in 2019 arrived at the conclusion that the allegations that Jan Oberholzer was conflicted were baseless in the sense that his conflict had been declared. The third point I forgot to add there, Peter, was that there were allegations that Mr. Oberholzer had had meetings with a supplier, which is Avenge, and with Sikonathi Stocks, meetings that seemed to be irregular in terms of the complaint. Advocate Mkwane arrived at the conclusion that, one, there was no basis to the allegation of a conflict of interest because the interest of Mr. Oberholzer had been declared. Briefly, let me tell you what that interest was. Jan Oberholzer initially left the employment of Eskom at the end of December 2008, after 28 years of service. And in 2018, he was headhunted by Eskom, and when he accepted the appointment in July, was placed in charge of the Medupi power station, where he inherited a company called Sikonathi Stocks that now at this point had a contract at the Medupi power station. In his CV, Mr. Oberholzer had also shown that he had, in the 10 years he had left Eskom, had also worked for Sikonathi Stocks. And in his declaration of interests, when he arrived at Eskom in July 2018, he declared that he held shares, 33,000 shares in Sikonathi Stocks.
Did he
was
say
signed off by the chairman of Eskom,
did he
who was
say
also chief executive.
specifically? Sikonathi?
Sikonathi Stocks, specifically the shares.
Did he say
shares
that in the declaration?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
In his declaration of interest, which he has to do annually. And when the point that then Mr. Vavi is correctly talking about is in meetings thereafter that concerned that company, Mr. Oberholzer did not recuse himself. And Advocate Kasim in 2020, when he was asked again because of new allegations that were leveled against Jan Oberholzer, Eskom reopened the investigation and asked Nazir Kasim to interview anybody, including Mr. Oberholzer and anyone else that can contribute to him making arriving at a finding. The finding he arrived at was similar to the finding of Advocate Mkwane the previous year, in which Advocate Kasim accepted that Jan Oberholzer had declared his interest. He also said, as Mr. Vavi correctly points out, that then you should not have sat in that meeting. Yes, we accept that you have declared your interest. You should not have sat in that meeting. And for that reason, we recommend Eskom will cancel you. I wanted to know what is the definition of cancel in this instance. The definition of cancel was that Eskom must have a discussion with Jan Oberholzer about him not having had to sit in that meeting for his shares that at that point were worth 6,000 rands. That's the first point. The On the conflict of interest matter, where they said he had not declared his shares, Advocate Nazir Kasim, as did Mkhwane before him, accepted that there is nothing, there is no basis to this allegation because a proper declaration had been made. On the matter of 42 million rand, Advocate Nazir Kasim arrived at the conclusion that, one, in a report to Eskom dated the 4th of April, he said, one, we are aware this matter is before a court of law. However, that does, in the interest of transparency, this does not prevent Eskom from pursuing a disciplinary charge against Jan Oberholzer. Let me again briefly tell you what that court case is. Avenge claims in an invoice 42 million rands to Eskom, and Jan Oberholzer is head of that department. And let's make one thing very clear quickly here. He's not accused of owning shares in Avenge. That's a different matter. So Avenge claims 42 million rand, saying it's completed the project that it was hired for. And the gentleman that has to certify that refuses and says, no, we disagree. And Jan Oberholzer says, but this supplier has done his job, so please pay. In the end, the money was not paid, and Avenge went to court. That matter was argued in court on the 18th of May, and judgment is pending. Nazir Kasim, then, when he becomes aware, he writes to Eskom on the 22nd of June, 2020, and says, in my report on paragraph 39 and 40, I had recommended that there be a disciplinary hearing, but it has now come to my attention that judgment on the matter is pending. It therefore would not be proper for Eskom to conduct a disciplinary hearing into anyone pending that judgment. So at this point, the High Court in Johannesburg had argument on the 18th of May 2020, with Avenge claiming 42 million rand for work it did for Eskom. Eskom has not paid on that contract and is defending the case. Let's remind the viewers again. Jan Oberholzer was of the view that this contract should be paid up and Avenge should get its money for this. And the gentleman in question here, who we are not naming, said, no, I'm not paying them. And the gentleman reported to Jan Oberholzer, and for that reason, he lodged a grievance against him. The High Court must now make a decision whether Eskom must pay Avenge the 42 million rand, or whether indeed Eskom is entitled to not paying Avenge. Advocate Nazir Kasim has said in a report, in a supplementary report to Eskom on June 22nd, he says the matter is now pending judgment at the High Court. Therefore, there is no point, we do not see any point in Eskom conducting a disciplinary charge or a hearing against anyone until the judgment has been passed in that case. Here's the reasoning behind that, Peter. If the High Court finds that Eskom indeed does owe and should have paid 42 million rand to Avenge, a construction company that did work for Eskom, Mr. Oberholzer will have been correct in insisting that the company should be paid. However, if the court finds indeed that Eskom should not be paying on that contract because, as it says in court, the work has not been completed, then the gentleman in conflict here with Mr. Oberholzer will have been correct. For that reason, Eskom cannot take a disciplinary charge against anybody, because there are two people here now, one who declined to pay on a contract and one who insists on paying a contract. The matter has been argued in the court and judgment will be passed. Eskom said in its statement announcing the result of the investigation into Jan Oberholzer on April 15, 2020, said Eskom will await the outcome of the court case and then proceed accordingly. And that is not in dispute. even in this discussion with Mr. Vavi. The last point I wish to add, Mr. Ndoro, I'm quite pleased to see my colleague, Mr. Vavi, climbing down from serious allegations of corruption against Jan Oberholzer to now saying possibly it was a mistake on his part. Previously, Mr. Vavi did not even want to hear evidence against Oberholzer. He said he must be dismissed immediately. I am pleased, therefore, that he has now come to the party and willing to consider the facts as they stand before us. And from his own speech, he has a problem with the judgment of Advocate Nazir Kasim, not action Eskom has been mandated to take, because we have implemented Advocate Nazir Kasim's report to the T, and we are just waiting for the court outcome to then bring the matter to its logical conclusion on the 42 million rand matter.
All right, okay. I'm going to start unpacking this with both of you. I'll start with you, Mr. Mantshantsha. Should he not have recused himself from the SNF...
from the Stefanuti Stocks matter?
Yes, should he not have recused himself?
Mr. Ndoro, great question. Advocate Nazir Kasim has made his finding on that, his ruling, and he said you should have recused yourself from that meeting. And Advocate Nazir Kasim has then prescribed action for Eskom to take on that particular matter. It said Mr. Oberholzer should be cancelled. He accepted that he had made his declarations of his shares there, and he says, but you should have followed up and not sat in that meeting. Therefore, I recommend that Eskom must cancel Mr. Oberholzer.
Let me ask you this then.
There and there's no dispute on that.
Okay, let me ask you this then. What's the normal practice when a manager at Eskom does not recuse himself from a contract?
Peter, each case is treated on its own merits. Eskom's policy says, indeed, where there is a conflict, it must be declared, and then the person declaring that interest must recuse himself. Okay. Thereafter, each case then gets dealt with on its own merits.
All right, let's ask Mr. Vavi if he's satisfied with that. Mr. Vavi?
You are muted, Mr. Vavi.
Mr. Vavi, are you there? Mr. Vavi, please unmute. Please. There you go.
I was saying that you won't answer that question. You are asking, it's a very fundamental question. It is now raising issue of each case must be treated on its own merit. And let me say this, had this thing by another person other than Jan Oberholzer, where a person directly conflicted in a company that is now expanding its work to his benefit, that person would have been dismissed by Eskom at this stage. Bottom line. That's our bone of contention. He is now not going to be dealt with. He won't even face a disciplinary action. And we are being told that he must be counseled. Counseling is more like saying, well, naughty young man, don't do that again. Go and do your work, basically. For somebody who's sitting and signing documents in which he is going to benefit, you're saying you must be counseled. And Eskom says, thank you very much, we will counsel our naughty boy, case closed. Will it happen the same way if it was someone else? And we argue, never such a treatment will be meted to someone else. Now let me go back to Mr. Mantshantsha's speech. He makes again false claims. Here is the false claim. It is not the whistleblower that we are speaking on behalf of that submitted a claim of misdoings by Jan Oberholzer at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. It is a whistleblower we don't even know his or her name. The Zondo Commission investigated that and found out that indeed procedures were not followed. And that's why Eskom ended up not paying that 42 billion. Now, there's no way then that you can take a matter raised by someone else in the State Capture Commission and bring it into a grievance of someone else who have not made that allegation. I think that Mr. Mantshantsha's information is just wrong. So accordingly, there is nowhere where Advocate Mkawana makes a conclusion that that allegation is false, or any other allegation. I've got here the recommendations of Advocate Mkawana. There's nowhere where he talks about him clearing Jan Oberholzer of any wrongdoing. So this is still someone on overdrive to misinform and to mislead the public. That's the first point. The second point, the advocate Karim, in our view, made a mistake. Here is a mistake, Peter. There is nowhere in the declaration of interest where Jan Oberholzer mentioned Sikonathi stocks. Nowhere. And Sikonathi knows that sitting there. He only declared his interest at FNB, ABSA, and blah, blah, blah. It was only when this matter blew in his face, thanks to the work of the whistleblower, we don't know, that he is now forced to declare that in that FNB declaration of interest, there is a Sikonathi stocks company there in which I have shares. Surely you wouldn't say to a company as big as Eskom, it must allow very senior executives to hide their interest in the banks when they have to do the operations of the business, find out that then they sit in matters in which they are going to benefit. So there's no mentioning of Sikonathi in the declaration of interest of any kind, and we can challenge Sikonathi Mantshantsha to produce to you in the morning, where did Jan Oberholzer disclose in Eskom that he has shares in the Sikonathi stocks company? He didn't. He claimed or he disclosed.
Sadly, we're running out of time. So you want Mr. Oberholzer to resign, essentially?
Absolutely, including the people who are defending him. Sikonathi Mantshantsha included, the COO and the entire the board that is covering for him up. All of those people have said they are joining Eskom in order to clean it up. And yet they are allowing somebody so conflicted to be counseled for deciding on matters where he's going to benefit, to personally benefit.